February 10th operations work group. And we are going to start with public appearances. Do we have any public appearances? Okay, maybe we will move through public appearances. Okay, all right, fair enough. Good, we'll keep going. So we have 3 topics on the agenda today. The first 2 are action items for the upcoming board meeting and should be relatively brief. The third one is two kind of meaty topics around the budget for next year, both of which have, again, early actions associated with them, namely for workbooks. So Kelly, do you want to join? Oh. All right, Mike, sorry.
Mike, is that
No.
you?
Who's leading the first part of the meeting? All right, thanks, Sherry.
Mike is like, what?
Thank you.
So as Kate said, we will be having at the regular board meeting an item come up regarding attachment and detachment of property between MMSD and the Middleton Cross Plains School District. This will be pursuant to an agreement that was executed in 1999, whereby at this point 450 parcels are being transferred into MMSD and detached from the Middleton Cross Plains School District. Generally, the parcels are described as the Acacia Ridge neighborhood, and I will note that one of the properties is property that the school district purchased, meaning MMSD, in December of 2017.
Are there any questions? Chris?
First of all, thank you for bringing that forward. At this point, are any of the Acacia Ridge properties actually developed? Are there people living there? Are there homes there?
No, the properties that are coming up of the 450 are moving to the next phase. And part of that phase is that when developers actually go to build the on those plots, they have to let the home buyer know which school district the house is in. And so this is part of that process of letting them identify which school district the children in the neighborhood will be attending.
Thanks. And then one more question. At what point in this process do we talk about what we're giving to Middleton Cross Plains as part of the attachment, detachment? Like, we're getting Acacia Ridge, are we giving the commercial property?
It's, I believe there's one more commercial property that is set to be transferred from us to Middleton Cross Plains, but the action that needs to take place hasn't yet, so it hasn't come up before you.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this topic?
I'm all for this. I think this is a good idea, except that I'm afraid we're going to get the Swan Creek people now to show up at every meeting and say, why didn't you do that with ours?
And that was pursuant to an agreement that was made that once that property was attached to MMSD, they could not go back. So
Understood. I just wanted to have something to tell them when they email me.
that was pursuant to an agreement.
Any other questions? Okay, so that will be on our February board meeting this month for a vote.
Just to remind, if you guys have any concerns or questions before the vote, get it to our staff.
Yep. Second topic.
Surplus assets. So earlier, or towards the end of last year, it came up that there were issues with the surplus assets policy in that disposal of certain items was not easily done without multiple district people being involved. And so essentially what we did was we streamlined the policy and combined in areas where we could. And the policy now generally will cover general assets, which is anything that's not otherwise categorized, instructional materials, and surplus music instruments. For me, this came to my attention when we had a whole bunch of really old microscopes that no one wanted, but based on the old policy, we couldn't figure out how to get rid of them. At that point, we went through a really laborious process of trying to place them for auction, but they were so old, nobody wanted them. And then we had to catalog it and go through an auction site. And so that was the impetus for us trying to streamline this policy so that it's easy to follow and everybody in the district is much happier that they can say, I have an asset, this is the value, can I proceed with moving it outside of the district?
Thank you.
My one question I've heard, I talked to several of the music teachers regarding this, and there's often a lot of times a shortage on instruments. Is there a way to notify them if there are surplus instruments? Because I've heard a lot of music teachers saying, I'm spending half my period fixing equipment.
Our arts coordinator is actually working on that, and he does have some ways of actually recycling some of the instruments that are broken so that we can get credit to buy new instruments, and he's keeping tabs of what we have, what's missing, and who needs what.
Thank you.
Chris?
So thanks for giving us some of the impetus behind this. It helps to understand the changes. I appreciate that. I just had one comment, and that is in section 1, AD, I think it is. It says that assets not transferred, sold, or given away may be destroyed. And I'm wondering if we could, because we're trying to become a greener district, I wonder if we could just add something in there that we will make every attempt to recycle
Yes.
or repurpose before we destroy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other comments on this policy? Okay. Again, that one will be up for a vote at the end of February, so if you do come across any comments, make sure that we can get them to the team in a timely manner. So. All right. Thank you, Sherry. Kelly, is it you and Lisa? All right. So I think there's 2 break points in this discussion. The first is really around workbooks, and then the second will be more around the special education policy and a couple of other areas. Is that right? Okay. So if you can hold your comments until, oh wow.
So we'll break on page 4, after page 4?
No, it's like 16 or something.
Did you get into special ed by 4? Okay. And this,
The first 5 pages are always the same.
right.
All right. Trying to get started, Jane?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the February Operation Work Group. As you can tell, I am slightly losing my voice. So I have my partner in crime here next to me who will help me if my actual voice disappears, but I think we can make it through. So tonight we continue our great work on the 2021 budget. And tonight we'll specifically we'll kind of do a reminder of where we are in the budget development process, and then as Kate mentioned, we'll specifically dive into the staffing structures, looking at our plans for central office staffing schedules, along with kind of our school workbook allocation, which will go out in about the next week. At the end, then, we'll focus on summer school. We focus on summer school at this time of year because the budget is always an early approval item, and you'll be asked to vote on the summer school budget in the March regular board meeting. So we'll invite Bree up when we get to that part of this agenda. So we always start our budget meetings putting our foundation of the work in front of us. Up on the screen is our educational equity policy. This is the board's policy that drives our budget work, and that gives us our guidance for the allocation of resources in line with our equity vision. We just want to make sure everyone realizes we have an equity policy kind of already created, and the goal here is to implement that policy to the best of our fidelity. The strategic framework that the board has voted on and put in place then is our tool by which we implement that educational equity policy. The strategic framework puts forward not only our mission and our core values of our district, but ultimately these 3 goals. And it is very important that within the budgeting process we ground ourselves in the goals of the framework in order to ensure that the investments that we're making are the highest investments as they relate to outcomes for kids. The budget goals on this slide right here is what we all discussed in the January operation work group. And what we all agreed to are the goals for this current year's process. So our team Lisa, myself, our HR team, and then those who work with us then put our budgeting goals as the work we're headed towards by the time we hit June. And that's the bullets we have up on this screen. The guiding principles also we talked about in depth in January. And our guiding principles you can think of as our guideposts. It's the work that our team does within those guiding principles in order to get to our goals. So you putting forward the goals and the guiding principles really helps us do the on-the-ground work in order to get ready for you for the draft April budget release. So this is where we are in that overall timeline. We've set forth our revenue projections and our revenue strategy. We've set forth the goals, the guiding principles, and we've discussed and built into the budget our compensation goals. So that moves us on to the next big rock in our budget, which is our staffing projections, and as I mentioned, the summer school budget. When we move forward into March, next month, what we're going to be doing is sharing with you where we were able to get to with our healthcare providers. Our HR team is literally negotiating with our healthcare providers kind of as we speak. This is a really big week for us in that negotiation team. So we'll have the results of that in the March Operation Work Group. We can't get them to you any earlier. We'll also share in that meeting our current thinking about where our strategic equity projects lie for next year and where we think we can make the biggest impact for kids by doubling down on some of our resources and supports for students. That will be in March. That meeting is very important because in the regular board meeting, we will be asking you to do early budget votes. And every year we have early budget votes, and we need to do that because our year starts July 1, and certain items require planning before the July 1 kind of new year starts, or requires investments that happen in July and August. So the early budget votes that we're looking at for this year will be summer school, which is kind of typical. Our health care benefits, we'll be looking for an early vote in March. Linked to kind of the referendum strategy, but also the fact that last year we did not do an early vote and we just didn't get the communication out to staff in time. So we'll be looking for an early vote on healthcare. And then there's always potentially a few equity strategies that as we talk in March, we'll decide if a couple of those should come early based on our discussions. So I want to make sure that's out there and fully kind of understood. You've seen the two budget kind of strategies for our two budgets before. So this is a reminder that as we talk, we're building a does not pass referendum budget and a passes referendum budget. The green boxes are what we've already been through together since November. Yellow boxes where we're focusing on today. And the green boxes are what the work we'll be doing together in March and April. The budget scenario slide you have seen. I've made one slight adjustment since we reviewed this together in January. And that is based on the board's feedback at the January Operation Work Group meeting. I increased the operational ask from $5 million to $6 million. You remember that we started this conversation in September and October. We were considering an $8 million ask and the operating referendum for 2021. We spoke in January, and it seemed like the board was coming down to potentially asking for $6 million in 2021. So I've adjusted this slide to where I think we're heading to March, but there's always that opportunity for the board in March to give us more different direction. So on the, what we already have baked in as a reminder for everyone kind of here and listening is the steps and lanes fully funded at $5.3 million and the does not pass and passes budget. We have the base wage built in at 1% for all staff and on average for all staff in the does not pass budget, which is a $2.5 million investment, and a 1.81 base wage increase, which is a $4.7 million investment in this budget. Since the last time we met, the state has provided the final CPIU numbers, which is 1.81%. So that 1.8 that we were estimating couldn't have come much closer to where the final number actually was. That will not change for us. That is the final number at this point. In January, then, we discussed how we were going to balance this budget and agreed to a potential $3 million reduction in staffing across the district. What we discussed in January was $1 million of that $3 million coming from central office staff. We'll get into that in a little bit more. And then the other $2 million from across the 50 schools. Looking at where we can find, move our class size in line with our class size policy. Employee benefits holds at a $0 investment at this point. And then we'll talk about the strategic group projects, required allowances, and how the rest of the $1 million balancing budget and the passing budget in March and April. So this is where we kind of are at this moment in our work, and these are where the big rocks are falling based on all the conversations we've had from November through today. So when we start the staffing conversation, we always have to start with where are our students and what are we looking at for enrollment projections. So we are looking at a slight reduction to enrollment for next year, about a 2% reduction, almost entirely at our elementary levels. And that is largely because our 4K and our kindergarten class sizes are coming in smaller than they had been in previous years. Now we know that is largely due to birth rates. To the birth rates here in Madison. And there's an enrollment report that clearly lays out the birth rate trajectory to show you the support behind that belief. With that said, with some of the smaller 4K and kindergarten classes currently coming in, what you see in the enrollment trend is how that plays out as these smaller classes continue all the way through 12th grade. What we know from the long-range facility planning process that's on our website, which is a 10-year and a 20-year study, is that we regain these same students through the growth that we're seeing in some of the outer areas of the Madison School District. One is the attachment-detachment policy you just spoke about in a previous conversation. So we're going to be getting these kids back in the kind of 5 to 10 year horizon as these new developments and houses are built. But we have to be watching for our current enrollment trends and adjusting in the short term. And the way we adjust in the short term is by working through the class size policy that the board has passed and taking other efficiencies across the system wherever and whenever we can. So the slide that in front of you is just to give you a grounding in what staffing actually looks like here in Madison Metropolitan School District. So we have approximately 4,000 staff. About 83% of our budget pays for those salaries and the benefit package. 76%, or almost 3,000 of those staff members, are allocated through the school workbook process that Lisa's going to talk about in just a minute. So it's a large part of our budgeting work. The remaining 24% is kind of all the other staffing in the school district. 12% is allocated centrally out to schools. That includes PSTs, advanced learning specialists. It even includes our custodians, people who are allocated centrally, but every day they work out in schools and are linked directly to a school. So together, that's 88% of all staff sit in schools. 5% of our staff are at FLOM, mostly food service and a little bit of trades, or Hoyt, which is mostly MSCR. And then the remaining staff, 7%, sits primarily here in central office supporting schools through the work of central office support. Our main objectives here in central office are to make sure we're minimizing distractions at schools and making schoolwork most efficient. You can think about things like the payroll process and vendors, contract payments, the work Sherry does, the work my office does, and then of course all the supports from HR around hiring, or supports from Lisa's team around reading, math, science, social studies. There's a small number of people here who support schools centrally. As it relates to the central office staffing process, what we have built into the budget is a 3% reduction of staffing from central office. Those positions here that are largely based here, we're looking at a 3% reduction. That's the $1 million of staffing reductions that I mentioned in January. It still holds in the budget today. And those final decisions will be made in the upcoming weeks through Jane, SLT and Jane, as we communicate kind of the impacts of some of those decisions in the upcoming weeks. On the school workbook side, Lisa's going to walk us through the process.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So this is a quick overview of what our internal allocation process looks like. I work pretty closely with the teaching and learning team and Kelly's team to, way back in November, actually reset the workbook to what it was like the year before, so that we can actually make some comparisons workbook to workbook, and then make reductions or adds where we need to based on enrollment changes. So this just gives you a little bit of a peek into all the work that's been going on since actually the end of November. So we've gone back and we reset any conversions that were in workbooks, any class size changes that we needed to make, any staffing changes due to enrollment, we would have reset and analyzed. Then we run our workbooks through a model, thinking about what the enrollment projections are. And this year we staffed our workbooks at the optimal class size +1. And I'll show you what the class size policy is in a little bit, but that's what we did. So it was a +1 this year off optimal. We established those class size parameters and lived by those. We managed the AGR former SAGE contracts. Those are in the same schools, no changes. And then we also work through always our categorical allocation, particularly related to special education, and then OMGE, or our bilingual and ESL allocation. So we run this all through the model, and we take a look at maybe some places where the model did or didn't work, and we reflect and we check again. And we look at schools from year to year changes to see what kind of a cumulative impact might impact schools. We look at where Title I is happening for schools and how that plays into the funding. We look at new and continuing program implementations, where we're growing up, dual language or AVID, or where 4K is. So where we are right now, where the arrow is, we're doing final reviews from chiefs, superintendent, teaching and learning, final reviews on Title I, final reviews on workbook. We have a virtual meeting this Wednesday. It's the last meeting. And then workbooks go out Friday by 4 o'clock. So this is a big week for lots of folks down here. And schools have been doing a really great job this year with chiefs doing pre-planning. The chiefs have been really explicit with schools around some of the changes that are occurring, particularly in schools where enrollment is going down, or where we expect some Title I resources to go down for schools based on poverty. So we feel that schools are actually in a much better place now than they were last year to do some problem solving. Okay, so this looks very familiar to all of you. This is our board approved class size policy, and we staffed our workbooks at optimum +1. So if you look at that optimum size, AGR, non-AGR, that is the model that we use to staff our workbooks for this year.
And so what that looks like out at the staffing level, and as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at a 3% reduction here at central office, and out at the schools it looks like about a 1.5% reduction on average. At the elementary level, you're looking at about 10 positions down overall, and largely at elementary this is due to the enrollment decreases that we mentioned earlier, is the majority of the change. As it relates to the kind of the budget reduction and the optimal +1 in the middle and the high school, what we were finding when we did our analysis is that our class size ratios and our overall staffing to student ratios at middle and high were getting as low as our elementary level. And that's primarily because middle and high school have not taken any reductions in the last few years, even as enrollment has either stabilized or ebbed and flowed. And that's primarily because of kind of where our attention was on the class size policy and implementing that. And so we sat down with the chiefs and really talked through our instructional model and our instructional vision. And we wanted to make sure that we were maintaining those class sizes in elementary, and we could allocate to the middle and the high schools well within the class size policy. But that our where we were looking was going to be at the secondary level due to the fact that they haven't taken any reductions in the last couple of years where elementary has. So that's largely an instructional strategy and is still well within the bounds of the class size policy itself. Our unallocated numbers, as you'll see up on that screen, are pretty low going into the upcoming year. Well below half of what we had last year. We try to run with at least a kind of 8, and we're just below that. And it may dip even a little more yet by the time we hit Friday, due to some specials allocations and need for bridging and things. But we really believe the best thing to do at this point is to make sure that the staffing is assigned out to the schools, and we just didn't want to hold any back and unallocated more than we needed to. So 6 is where we've kind of landed. And ultimately what that means is when it gets to August and September, we'll have to be very careful about where we give back based on, kind of enrollment trends. And we'll have to be watching the low class sizes. When we end up with class sizes of 10 and 11, we may need to pull sections. We try not to because we know that disrupts the schools, and we will continually try not to. But it does mean that in August and September, we're going to have to be watching those counts pretty closely.
The only add I would make on that, and it's something that I'm reminded of every time we go into this, you'd think after 7 years I would remember this, but every time we add an FTE back, it's actually 1.6 at the elementary level because of specials. Because you also have to add art and music and PE and reach allocations. So with every 1 FTE that gets added back, it's not exactly a 1-to-1. You always have to add some extras back for specials. And we've been working really hard with human resources to actually do a little more front loading of specials this year to get out of this a 10th here and a 10th there that makes everybody crazy. So we went a little more all in on that, and I actually think we have it a little more right going in like that this time.
Yeah, we think so.
And then I would just call attention to the last 2 phrases that Kelly has up there. We just pay attention to the staff to student ratio at elementary, middle, and high school, and our ratios are still very low, even despite the enrollment made reductions up above. Okay, so this is our initial workbook strategy at elementary school, and I would just, I always remind people that it is really early. It's February, and workbooks go out Friday, but a lot can happen between now and August. A lot can happen between August and 3rd Friday, so this is where we started, and knowing that there will be places we may need to adjust moving forward. So as Kelly said, an overall slight reduction due to enrollment primarily, and any remaining reductions would have been to minimize those outliers according to the class size policy. So our target at K1 at AGR schools was 19 per section, that's optimal +1. Target at the other K1 was 21 per section where possible. That's optimum +1 as well. That just gives you an example. None of our K-12 sections are over the policy maximums with the way the workbooks are set up, and less than 10% of our sections are under the class size minimums, and we'll continue to watch that. At the secondary level, because of some of the reductions that they have, we actually gave them some increased flexibility to support their instructional design. So at middle school, our staffing levels were aimed at 26 per section, again following the optimal +1. This is actually the good news on this slide. We continue to have access. We added a little bit more to middle school world language to make sure 6th and 7th graders have access to those courses so that they can enter high school at a level 2. Our academic and career planning, which is required by state statute, that is still in place with allocation, and our AVID programs and coordinators are still in place. At the high school level, staffing level again at optimal +1, with extra attention to the outliers and any special reporting for anything over 30. And just a reminder, at the high school, scheduling is a bit more of a puzzle, given the different kinds of electives, any singletons that might be out there. And again, we schedule and provide classes for students based on voice and choice that students and families make when they enroll in their high school courses. There will be probably a slight reduction in non-teaching personnel, given some additional flexibility at the secondary level to make sure that those class sizes are maintained. And then any personalized pathways, FTE, is the same as last year.
All right. I think this is our pausing point.
One more. I think we get through this one first.
Okay, so every year we try to be actually more efficient and strategic, and this is also a slide that we're actually pretty proud of, even within an enrollment decline. So new for this year, what we're recommending is an additional $500,000 in additional special education staffing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. We are holding a spot for a potential strategic equity project around safety and security assistance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next month. Our Director of Early Learning has spent a great deal of time adjusting our 4K sections. We have targeted 4K sections to mostly, if possible, their neighborhood schools, trying to eliminate overflow as much as possible. So if we noticed, based on trend data, that, for example, we were overflowing Albium students to another school, we would have added a section at Albium rather than adding an overflow section in another school. So Colleen did a really nice job looking at trend data with that, and she was also able to streamline transportation so that we don't have as many routes going to the overflow areas. So that's a real win for us there. Continuing from 1920, the investments that we made, the supplemental staffing for ELLs, our ESL and BRT allocation, there's actually a little more at the secondary level because of the enrollment decline, again, at elementary. Our psychologists, counselors, and social workers remain at the increased funding from last year. We added $800,000 last year. We're maintaining that. We've maintained the advanced learning funding and staffing levels. We added just about $400,000 last year, and we're maintaining the achievement gap reduction contracts in the schools where they're currently attached.
So Kay, is this where you wanted to pause?
Yeah, that's a lot of information.
Yep.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
Appreciate the work. Thank you. Just going to tell you where I'm at. I appreciate the cuts in central office because I want more people in the classroom. Personally, I like less in Doyle and more of them, the Doyle staff in the actual classrooms. I think that might be helpful, but that could be a pipe dream, so I'm trying my best on that. But my other issue with that is there any way to build in the 1.8 if the referendum goes through, instead of build it at 1.0 for the teachers?
So Nikki, that's exactly how it's built in.
Okay.
So
I
when
wanted to make sure I read it right.
So in the passing referendum, the entire 1.8, which is the highest allowable by law, is built in.
Okay.
Done.
And my other questions are all on special ed, so I'll wait until that part.
I could not understand really well without the voiceover. No. Just from like before.
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, your voice is fine.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people say. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain to us. I had a couple of, can you put it in a class size?
Yep. That one?
Around this, because I know this is it's a very controversial issue overall, and I don't want us just to really center where my main concerns are around this one, is that this method still looks very much as like equal treatment of classes, right? Versus what every teacher can handle, specifically new teachers, right, in the district. Also, school to school, what does it look like, additional supports. In addition, something that came to my attention this year at Cherokee, when there are classes that require multiple equipment, right? So they might have a Chromebook, they might have, I think I visited a robotic class, so they might have like an additional box, and they might have like their notes. And so what does it look like when we're talking about space and adding that +1? When, if it was an English class and the only thing that they needed was a Chromebook versus a robotic class versus a music class that the instrument is larger. So how do we reconcile the sort of the need and how do we elevate the need by each teacher and type of classroom when we are doing sort of this broad strokes sort of
Yeah.
procedure?
Let me take a stab at that, and then Kelly adds certainly if you feel like it. Particularly secondary principals, and because Ananda, you are right, the class size policy, aside from the AGR factor, is just a head count, right, policy. It doesn't really have any other weighted sort of factor to it. We've been doing a lot of work on scheduling at the secondary level, at middle school and high school, and really helping those principals to figure out sort of where could you go lower with a class size and where could you take a little bit bigger classes a little bit based on the kind of class and the needs of the students. So for example, at high school, I know this is an example at East with their freshman academy, they keep those classes low and they take a little bit higher classes in some of the other grades. And it is real, right? Some of the science or technology classes, you have to think differently about class size, and you may have to offer multiple sections of those with smaller class sizes, and then you would want to build your schedule in a little bit differentiated way. And our principals have really done a lot of work on scheduling. They should really be proud of it to get after some of the intricacies in scheduling that aren't equal across the board. So yeah, there are different ways through a schedule that you can manage some of that. And I would say that the other piece is, and I was going to share this in a slide to come, but we had a small group of principals help us with this class size policy and help us interpret that together. Those smell really yummy too. So I had a group of 4 elementary principals and we went through the class size policy and we looked at flexibility, and we are allowing principals greater flexibility with the class size policy this year. So if they can justify by need, if they want to keep a team together, if they want to go below the class size policy in one grade level and maybe go a little bit higher in another, they can do that this year. They can work with their chief and work with us to do that. Now, we would certainly look at, certainly 30 kids in a first grade would not be acceptable. But within a couple of students around the maximum or the minimum, if they have a rationale and are working within their allocation, they certainly have the flexibility to do that. So we talked a lot about that. We actually opened up the entire staffing workbook for them to look at, school by school. We go school by school, we go grade by grade, and we walk them through, and we paid attention to where the class sizes were a little tipping toward the higher side and where they were lower. And we had a really long meeting with them a couple of weeks ago about that. And I think I can say that they appreciate the flexibility. Do principals always want more allocation? Absolutely. I did too when I was a building principal, and I'd done anything to do it for my building. But I do feel like we worked hard to give greater transparency this year to the process. So I hope that answered a little bit.
Yeah, no, it did. I appreciate hearing that because it really touched to my point, and this concern in particular, Cherokee, was brought from the principal. Now, although I appreciate the flexibility from the principal, there is also the other side is, how do we ensure teacher's voice and that? And I'm thinking in particular after kindergarten, when we kind of know what the class, who are the students, how many students with IEPs we're going to have, what levels of support we need, what are the scoring based on standardized tests, so we have a kind of a greater sense of what the class composition is. What is it? What are some of the, what are we baking into the system so that we end up not having a principal to then go the +1 when the teacher's like, this is not manageable?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. We have a couple things. John and Sylvia both have for their categorical allocation reports that they run about the density, the numbers of students in a class based on the recommended density from the special education plan or the ELL plan. There's a recommendation that you stay within a certain % or below in each class.
Per class.
Yep. We also have built in a very structured workbook and Title I approval process. So they've been going through sort of pre-conversations with their chiefs now. They will be coming in next week already for lab time. Every principal comes in for 1 to 2 hours and we work through everything. And no one leaves the lab unless every conversion is taken care of and approved. If they convert regular ed, special ed, or other categorical or between categories, that's all has to be approved. Then there's one more process that is just principals and chiefs, and that's the final sign-off. And within that final sign-off, principals meet with the chiefs and talk about what their communication plan is. How are they planning to communicate? How have they worked with their staff to ensure that their SBLT knows what's going on, that their teachers know what's going on, and what's the accountability for that moving on. So there are multiple checkpoints in the system to be sure that, right, we also want to be sure that principals are using categorical allocation the way that they should be, according to state and federal law for students who have rights under those laws, and then that they're able to articulate how they're best using allocation for other students enrolled in their building.
Thank you.
So thank you for this detailed presentation. It's really helpful. I have a few questions. I want us to just start with clarify the $1 million that we're cutting from administration. Is that FTE cuts or is that just budget cuts?
The $1 million is FTE cuts. If you look back at the previous slide, it was an additional $800,000 in that negative line. The $800,000 will be on the non-personnel side. The $1 million is on the personnel side. So
Got it.
together
Okay.
it's about 1.8.
So it's really 1.8. Okay. Can we go back to the workbook staffing level slide? I think it was slide 14.
That one?
Yeah,
That one.
you were there and then you went back.
Oh, okay.
That one, yep. So when I counted up the positions, including the unallocated positions, I came to like 41.2 FTE. Are we valuing that FTE at about $50,000 a head to get to 2 million? That seems low to me.
So it's 87,000 or 85,000 is the average number. The 6 unallocated are not in your count.
Okay,
Because they're staff waiting for a home.
okay.
Unallocated means we have them to allocate. They just are not allocated yet. We hold them until we see August and September numbers come in.
So it's really about 35 people at 85K per person, okay. I wanted to just ask for more clarity about front-loading specials. What does that mean?
Good question.
That's a very good question.
So we have guidance developed around specials where a certain FTE in specials matches how many classroom teachers are in the building. So if you have 20 sections in your elementary building K through 5, that might mean, as calculated, I'm making this up, like 1.2 music, 1.2 art, 0.9 Phi Ed. It's all calculated based on the number of sections. If we know schools are sort of on the bubble, or if all schools' special allocation comes in as 0.9, 0.9, 0.9, 0.9, we might front load and give schools an extra tenth to round their specials teachers up to a full 1.0. Or for that matter, if specials come in at 1.1, because of how the sections are allocated, we might either try to pair that specials teachers with another, we might try to go down and work on scheduling, because that's also tied to planning time. So we work really hard to make sure teachers are getting their planning time, whether they're specials teachers or classroom teachers. Heidi Tepp works with us really closely on that, but we found in some of the schools that are on the bubble, if we end up adding back next year anyway, we may as well bump it up a little bit now and be sure we have full-time people in schools rather than 0.9. We try really hard to keep our specials teachers as closely matched as possible, but it is tough. But I think we're a little better this year front loading.
I do too. So the complexity of scheduling schools is very hard to describe until you've actually attempted to schedule 3,000 adults and make sure that every teacher gets the planning time they deserved and that they get the lunch they deserve. And you do that by balancing the special schedules in, right? So when the kiddos go to art, music, or gym, that the teacher can have the time off that they need. And it's a very delicate balance. And in order to make it all work, you just need to round sometimes in order to ensure that someone has a full-time contract. So it might be, when Lisa says 0.9, that 0.9 of their time is accounted for in the school, meaning that they're, in a gym class, But we round up to 1. Well, what happens with that other 0.1? Well, they're in a school and they're helping
They can provide
the
additional
principal,
support.
additional
Yeah.
support, lunchroom, recess, whatever it is that they
Yep.
work out with the principal. We round up so that the school is more whole and that the teacher is more whole. That's essentially what it is.
So that might answer one of my questions, which was I was concerned that looking at Optimal Plus One for our workbooks would actually mean that we had more specials teachers who were split between schools. Does this mean we're actually looking at the same or fewer specials teachers next year who are split between schools? Or are we looking at increasing that number?
It's, if we were not to do kind of the front loading Lisa just mentioned, then it would be fewer special teachers. And those fewer special teachers would be in this count. It's not a count separate, it's embedded in that same 10. But when we went back and front loaded, as Lisa just mentioned,
We added
we
back.
primarily put them all back in.
So it's going to be about the same.
It'll be about the same.
Okay. I do think that that is something to keep in mind for staff retention. I think one reason we lose fine arts teachers is because of
That's
the travel
exactly
time
right.
between schools.
That's exactly
what we're
right.
also trying to
That's
do.
what we were trying to do.
Then
Yeah.
we're trying to work around that, make schedules a little bit better for them where we could.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that,
Yeah.
so thank you. I just had some questions about the high school allocations. I'm particularly concerned about high schools because if you go into the class size report we got earlier this year, there's like 161 high school, or 161 sections total that are over maximum, and the vast majority of those are at high schools. And some of that's because of how you count a section differently in elementary school than in high school. But that's a lot. It's still like over 130 sections in high school that are currently over the maximum. And if we're going to Optimal Plus One, I'm concerned that we could see more sections pushed above the maximum.
So if you were to look at the same report and look at minimums, you would find the same effect. And it's largely because of what Lisa just said. We give high school principals a lot of flexibility. And so as many as you might have kind of at the 30 range or at 31, you also have a lot of, Spanish 6 with 10 kiddos. We have advanced journalism that might have 10 or 12 kiddos. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so when we allocate to schools, we ensure that schools have enough staff to fund at the class size policy range. If we were to just take all the kids, all the staff, put them in a classroom, they have enough to staff. But high school scheduling is extremely complicated because kids select classes, so it's all on demand. Matching the demand to the supply in a high school of 2,000 kids is incredibly complex. And what they need to take to graduate, and what kids are really, really wanting because they love X, Y, and Z teacher, all that gets put into the mix. And schools, principals make the choice. And a lot of times that choice of the high classes is in order to meet student demand, because if they just can't fit a second class of something kiddos love with a teacher kiddos love, any principal will choose putting 5 more kids in that class versus telling 5 kids, no, you can't have that class, it's full, sorry. And that's just how high schools tend to play out.
I think this is another situation where you need to look at what the class is and what the demands
Oh,
on the
we
teacher
do
are
every
in
day.
that
We
class.
we do all the time through part of this process, as does Mike Hernandez.
That last approval process, we give principals a template actually to fill out where they have to specify where they believe they're going to go over or under on class sizes and what the rationale is for that.
Like adding 5 more kids to an AP history class could be a grading nightmare for the AP history teacher.
And that would be a conversation the principal and that teacher would have together in making that decision.
But that's just something we need to keep in mind when we look at Optimal
Yeah.
Plus One, is we could be increasing workload for our staff who end up in those classes where we end up increasing to try to maintain the variety of electives we offer, which is also really important, so. I totally agree with you 100% that scheduling at the high school level is crazy and complicated and like worse than any GRE logic problem you'll ever encounter. That said, part of what leads to that complexity is the strands we have in our high schools, specifically pathways and DLI are 2 that can lead to a lot of scheduling challenges. And I'm wondering, first of all, are we, Optimal Plus One is something we're applying, I assume, across the board to all sections in high school.
Yep.
But are we trying to maintain pathways and DLI class sizes smaller? DLI, pathways, I know that our target was to have 25 kids per section.
Yeah, there's
Are we going up to 29?
There's no explicit narrative around making sure Pathways is less or dual language is less. I mean, there's only a finite number of students actually in dual language. I mean, that you have to, yeah, I mean, that actually we have to provide for with a bilingual certified teacher. But there's no, we have not made any intentional comment that Pathways classes are smaller or bigger anywhere. We wouldn't want to set that up. What we are saying, though, is I think that principals in the high schools are actually trying to target those core classes in ninth grade, Pathways or not, to be sure that those kids are successful in their ninth grade year so that they can experience that success early.
So on the slide that said personalized pathways support remains static, that was really talking about like pathways coordinators?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
The high school positions that are, what are the words that you used? The slight reduction in high school non-teaching personnel, is that an administrative cut or a workbook cut?
Those are all out of the flex pool, the
Okay.
choice pool that
Got it.
principals want to choose from. We did not tell principals that they had to cut any categorical position. It's just in what they have as a big flex bucket.
All right, I am still concerned that optimal +1 at the end of the day does mean larger class sizes, and I'll be interested in seeing how this plays out, particularly in our smaller schools where you may be down to one section in a grade or combining grade levels to try to get above the minimum class size. And that leads to all kinds of challenges sometimes with trying to set classes that are good learning communities and, have kids separated who need to be separated. So I would just love to be continually apprised with how this is playing out in schools, not just in terms of how many bodies are in classrooms, but how well we're able to meet the learning needs of children and also the needs of the staff who are serving them.
Yeah, understood.
Hey, can you talk about some of the efficiencies you gained from kind of rerouting the 4K sections?
Yeah, sure. It's probably best with an example. Let me go back to the example. Oh, it wasn't even on. So Elvium is a school that had, I think, maybe 2 sections of 4K, 2 morning, afternoon. We had more students there actually than we had teachers for 4K, so we had to take any extra Elvium, like those filled really quick, and the additional Elvium 4-year-olds then actually had to be routed to a non-Elvium 4K site. So we've looked at enrollment trends over the years. We've sort of averaged out how many little ones that are 4 in that Elvium attendance area actually could attend there, and we added or took away based on what we saw in enrollment trends. And then we were able, the more you can keep 4-year-olds in their home school, the fewer routes you'll need. Some of it is space, You have a school that just doesn't have space, then those 4-year-olds have to go to what we call an overflow site. But she maximized the homeschool sites for 4-year-olds to keep as many 4-year-olds there as possible. We want to get as many of our community 4-year-olds in our programs.
So one of the reasons we can do this now is because of the smaller incoming 4K class that I just talked about a little bit ago. So what we're seeing is a little more space open up in the elementary, which gives us an opportunity for efficiency, which is bring the kiddos back to their homeschool site because there's now room to be in their neighborhood. Here's what we're banking on, and we'll watch this and we'll test it over time. One is that we will have more of our 4K kiddos who say they're going to enroll actually show up. Versus enroll, get told they're going to an overflow site, and then go choose somewhere else. Because that happens to us at fairly high margins when you're told to go to an overflow site. So we're banking on, in the short run, that 4K student not only transportation savings, but will likely show up. And then there are students through 12th grade. By and large, statistics would say, if we can get them in kindergarten, they're with us for the long haul. So we think it'll actually increase enrollment percentages of staying in 4th grade. And when we do have kids go to open enroll overflow sites, it's almost like we have to re-retain that family a second year from kindergarten, from 4K to kindergarten, because then they get routed back to their homeschool, and now the parent needs to make a choice again. So if we can find the right ways to keep our 4K kiddos in their neighborhood, they're more likely to actually stay in our school in 4K, and then even more likely to stay in our schools in kindergarten than under our current overflow model. That's the hypothesis, and that's what we want to play out and push harder on, not only this year, but potentially next year, as it relates to an overall kind of enrollment strategy.
Thank you.
I know we said we're giving principals more flexibility and teachers more flexibility, which I agree with, but I do remember last year Leopold had some problems because they used some of the Title I money to fund a third assistant principal. Is there a way that we could say that it's only used for categorical teachers or used for teachers in the classroom?
So, that's a really good question. Principals have discretion to use their school-based Title I money, and they actually can use Title I to fund an assistant principal. Last year, I know that the strategy there was with one lead principal and 2 assistant principals. That was actually their strategy for how they were going to develop their instructional design. I don't know what their strategy is this year. I know that the chief is working with Leopold on that, and certainly they will develop their workbook based on the needs of the students. But it is under Title I law, you actually can purchase an assistant principal with Title I dollars. It costs more, that's what you're referring to, right? Because Title I funding is built on average salaries, and the higher your salary goes, right, your Title I money doesn't quite go as far. So you're exactly right. I'm glad you brought that up, but that is actually an acceptable purchase is the wrong word, but you actually can do that out of Title I. But especially around administrators, that requires approval by the chiefs. That is something that the chiefs are right there supporting them on or coaching them about.
Thank you.
Did you?
I actually wanted to ask Anita, from a student's perspective, can you talk to them?
From a student's perspective, Anita, can you share with us, like, how does it, your experience at the high school, or like in your K-12 experience with class size?
Yeah, sorry, I'm a little sick, but I think in my classes that have been smaller, like my classes, like calc first semester, I had a class with around like 10 people, and I think it was more helpful for me to learn in that setting because, like, in such an intense class, it's easier for me when my teacher can, like, directly answer my questions because they're not, like, trying to address the needs of a larger class. And then second semester, I switched to the larger class with, like, 30 kids, and it was, like, a really big difference because I haven't been able to ask that many questions. And I think that I've noticed, like, a consistent trend throughout my high school is that, like, experience is that, like, in my larger classes, the same thing happens. Like, the teacher obviously has, like, more students to deal with, so they're not able to, like, I guess, answer your questions as often, or, like, you don't have as much time to go talk to them after class. And to, like, even in flex time, which is the time we have to ask our teachers questions, teachers that, like, have larger classes with, like, the subject you're in, I guess, like, with my AP Lane class, I haven't been able to, like, go and, like, talk to my teacher as much as I have in, like, other classes that I'm in, like Chinese 1 or something.
That's awesome that you're taking Chinese.
I was going to say you're taking really interesting classes.
So it's really interesting because, so I have a personal experience with teaching, and I have also personal experience, my daughter, where she feels sometimes in small class that is, depending on the subject, I can imagine calculus being, you know, a little bit more personal, but being actually boring and wanting to get out of the class and go to a class with more students because it becomes more dynamic. But I also, and that's what I was trying to highlight to Lisa, is like, I also remember one year I was teaching at Senate and had a really large class, and I was, like, the class was amazing, and I let more students come in because the class was amazing, and my support staff, the support staff there were also amazing, and we had a lot of relationship with students versus when I was teaching a class in Middleton, and it was like 11 children, or 11 teenagers, and I would feel, like, exhausted in a class, like I was teaching 100 kids, right? And so I wanted to figure out ways to sort of compensate for some, like to bring actually teachers' voice. Because I'm hearing what you're saying, because I do not want to limit student, like there's this amazing class with this amazing teacher, and now we're like, this is our policy, and we don't take anything else into consideration. And then, so to be able to bring teachers' perspective on that. But at the same time, it may be the same subject with a different teacher that might not apply, right? So I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we actually create the system, like that there's some flexibility, some nimbleness, but also be able to be, like a too deep equitable in a way that is actually also accounting for what the teacher has the capacity to handle. Right. Yeah, that was my.
I think Chris and Xavier both have a comment maybe around this, but.
Yeah, I just want to build on what you're saying, Ananda, and thank you for pointing out what you said about getting the teacher's voice at the table. I think another consideration in high school, and we're talking about grading at a later meeting, correct? Or at some point, I think we might talk about grading, but I know there's a push to get more grades in the grade book to help improve, give students more opportunities to raise grades or maintain good grades. And when you're increasing class sizes and also telling teachers to grade more, that's another thing that I think staff need to have some voice on. What's their workload like if we're asking them to do both of these things. I also went back to the workbook staffing levels and just took out the unallocated positions just because I like to play on my phone calculator while we're talking. I came up with about 35 FTE. When you subtract the 2020-21 workbook allocations from the 2019-20 and get not the percentage but an absolute number that's different, I came up with 35. Is that what you were getting? Are these numbers not quite right, maybe? Because that comes to almost
The
3
numbers are
million.
right, I just don't have the detailed spreadsheet
Yeah,
in front of
if
me.
you do the math at 85,000, it comes to about 3 million in cuts if you look at the numbers that are on slide 14. So I'm just not sure if those numbers are wrong or.
Oh, well, the 85 is an average.
Okay.
So you'll have new
Yeah.
teachers at 50, and you can have a position in there, at
If we were to
higher.
cut 35, or not allocate 35 positions, have 35 fewer positions, and on average, they're paying 85,000, that comes to almost 3 million right there. It's like 2.99 million. And so, but we're trying to cut 2 million from workbook staffing, so the math just isn't working.
I can look back at it and share the bigger spreadsheet kind of analysis with you. I just don't have it in front of you. But it all ties out.
It all ties out, and I'm just curious, like, anything we could do to help our K2 AGR classes maintain optimal class sizes, anything at all would be great, because we know from tons and tons of research that that's the time to help kids be caught up reading.
Lisa's process
Population
through the summer with Karen Kepler carefully looks at the kindergarten through second.
I really don't want to see K2 classes and AGR classes and AGR schools above 19 if we can help it, because it makes it harder to learn.
Xavier?
I'm wondering if some of the strategies used with front-loading specialists to decrease the number of special teachers going between schools per day, if we could also apply that to like school psychs and counselors and social workers that might have to travel in between schools.
Yeah, you're picking up exactly on the strategy. Jay and his team also, with John's help, if there are part-time positions that are in the support services area, we would take a look at that as well.
Or if it's like possible to partner with like some health providers to buy a few hours of a psychologist's time, or just brainstorming.
If I could also just add one thing, just for the general milieu and knowledge here. The AGR language at the state level actually allows school districts to apply that AGR pot of money in 3 different ways. 3 different ways that actually support the learning of students. Class size is one way. Another way is after-school tutoring. And another way you can use that money is for instructional coaching. So the state has said, even if you are an AGR school, you actually could go above 18 as long as you had a coaching strategy in place, or perhaps have used an after-school tutoring. So we as a district actually locally fund instructional coaches. It's like an $8 million investment at all of our schools. So I think we should be proud that we've continued that investment. That's also a strategy under AGR. So it's not nearly as strict as it used to be years ago with that hard cap. They are saying that there are 3 different strategies. So when we met with the small group of principals and we talked with them and we showed them the workbook, they said that they agree that those K-1 classes, especially in AGR, should be small classrooms. But if it gets to the point where you actually have, if it's 19 or 20 apiece and you have to add another section and redo your whole special schedule, Chris, you totally know how it goes. I could see you nodding over there, that they would rather keep those extra 2 and well support them with supplemental staff and services than have to sort of create the disruption. So, and I know you understand that too. Some of you that don't know that law, there are those 3 prongs to that law.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in. I have 3 comments or questions. The first one is maybe a little bit bigger picture. If you can go back to the enrollment page, I think it's page 10. I have a question and a comment, I guess, here, or an ask. The question is, so that our enrollment is going down by, in aggregate, 51 this year, but I think we're playing a little bit of catch-up in terms of fitting our class sizes and staffing to enrollment.
Yep.
It's projected to go down by triple to more than triple that over the next 4 years. Is that built into our referendum projections? Because that would be a fairly significant staff reduction each year if we were aligning staffing to enrollment.
Yes and no. When we built the referendum projections, we had last year's enrollment report, which is a decline, but not quite as steep as this one is this year. Like if you were to compare their 2 reports, you'll see it's a slight bit steeper than it was in the past. So we are projecting a slight decline. But it is very important to remember that when you're in the budgeting world, DPI uses a 3-year weighted average. And they do that on purpose. It's built in to protect schools from enrollment loss. I mean, the law is very intentional to protect, not to protect, but just to help give school districts softer landings is what a 3-year average enrollment does. So it makes this type of loss much smoother. It's not, in the revenue side, you don't actually see 163 overnight, right? And as I mentioned around the 4K strategy, of course, we're looking at other strategies as ways to increase enrollment. We can't change birth rates. That is what it is. But obviously, we can do other strategies that help with open enrollment, reducing our open enrollment out and gaining open enrollment in, for example. Other strategies across the district focusing on enrollment are other ways we have within our control to potentially change this. We can't change birth rates, but 50 kids here or there is within our reach.
It might help me to just see a follow-up on what, if this were, and I appreciate that this is a more steep decline than we've seen earlier, but if this were to come to pass, what would that look like for kind of year 4, just to make sure that we're targeting the referendum in the right place? The other, just, I guess, ask on this page is, our 20-year enrollment report from Andrew's team says something really different than this.
It does.
And it's probably the most important projection that we have to drive staffing, funding, instructional opportunities. And we got an email earlier this week about the number of electives at East, and East has the least kids of any of our high schools, so there are also less classes, right? It drives everything, just the number of kids. And so I would really love to see something helping us tie these 2 stories together from the data and statistics team. By right now, we're, I think, over 10% off just the elementary numbers today. If you just compare this to that report, and there's no perfect version of projecting the future, but I think we're far enough in that it would be worthwhile to help us kind of calibrate where our enrollment trends really are going. So that is an ask I appreciate. The other two questions are smaller. If you go to the previous page, how the required allowances line, can you speak to how much of that line is the 2X charters? I'm trying to calibrate, I'm trying to understand, is the reduction in enrollment, which is essentially -2 coming out of our schools, is that following the kids and going into 2X charters? Is it about the same amount, or is that not?
We're projecting on it's not directly linked, but as it relates to the 2X charters, we're predicting a loss of 60 full-time equivalent kids. So at 4K,
Additional next year from.
additional next year loss.
Okay, so what is it right now?
It's about $9,000 per
Sorry,
student.
the number of kids right now.
Oh, right now, 230.
Okay.
So we're predicting at least another 60 FTE. And our new 2X charter alone is opening up at 60 FTE. So
60 kids.
the assumptions are that the new 2X charter Democratic Milestone will fill up with the 60, but that only 80% of them will come within Madison's boundaries. We'll assume that they're going to enroll from some other school districts. And that a portion of them will have maybe never enrolled in like MMSD before, so it's not really a loss, meaning if they came from a parochial school or something from within, or they pull a student that maybe wasn't enrolled at all in school in. So that's in there, and then we make projections around One City and Isthmus regarding their enrollment rate. Based on the last 2 years' worth of data, how many will come from within MMSD, how many would have otherwise been enrolled here or not.
And then my last question, or comment, hope, is around the class size below minimum. I say this every year, but I remain hopeful that we will pick up some of the kind of multi-year strategies that would let us really reduce those, particularly in elementary, where I believe it is possible if we're at 10% below 15 kids. I hope the board can pick up some of the ways that we could tackle that. Multi-year is something we've discussed, or multi-age is something we've discussed before, needing to go along with an instructional approach and philosophy, but there are also other ways to get at that, either from combining K2s and 3 to 5s, et cetera. So I think that's money waiting for us on the table that gives kids a really nice sized classroom that's not too big, but also frees up resources for some of the classrooms that are on the larger side. So otherwise, I think, this is it's going to be a tough year in some ways, but I think you've done a really nice job, and in particular the chiefs have done a really nice job facilitating a process to get us to kind of a good landing spot for our schools. So thank you. Anyone who has any comments? Gloria, Ali?
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to go through a high-level summary on our special education allocation pilot that we did this past year. We implemented a weighted student formula in one of our attendance areas. We wanted to try out a formula and a new process that was based on student need, not just head count. So we worked to redesign that formula and that process, and these are some of the things that we did this year. So we based our allocation in the weighted student formula area based on what we know is already written in our IEPs, and regenerated weights by categorical area based on our own data. As I said, we piloted this within one attendance area. We wanted to try it, and that was Memorial. So just as a reminder, we added last year 5.5 additional teacher allocation in the Memorial attendance area, and we added 11 additional district-wide allocation. We worked with our Memorial principals to develop a professional learning community this year with principals and assistant principals. We called it our network improvement community. We gathered feedback, we did surveys, and based on that feedback and what we learned, we actually had some changes and decisions that we made that we think will develop an improved process and weighted system. So we gathered quite a bit of data, and we got quite a bit of information from our schools around this. We added some leadership and coaching and mentorship for principals in that weighted student area, and we also increased collaboration across schools. So just as a reminder, when we were doing this work in the pilot area, it was not just about how much allocation was provided, but also how well those resources were being used. And it was about the weights and the formula and that actual technical work, as well as improving the actual process that was used to create an instructional design. So these are some of the high points that we learned in the pilot area. So we made some quantitative adjustments based on the learning. We actually took a look at where any adjustments had to be made in special education in that pilot area. And we actually found that the majority of the allocation changes were around students who had autism. So we actually are proposing increasing that weighting based on need moving forward in our formula. We have learned that that supplemental SEA hours needs to be beefed up a little bit so that principals and schools have a little more flexibility based on student need and supervision areas to hire and employ SEAs to meet those needs. We also are increasing the decision-making that principals have at the school level and are proposing a small reduction in the required cross-categorical base. And we would take that reduction in base, we wouldn't take it away, we would move it into the flex teacher. Here's an example of that. Let's say a school by the formula ends up getting allocated at the base level 3.5 teachers. It can be really hard to have a half-time special education teacher despite all great intentions working in a school with students who have needs all day long. So that half-time is actually being moved into the flexible area so that principals can go ahead and use that allocation based on the needs of their students. We have talked about expanding our network improvement community pilot district-wide. What we found is that principals have really appreciated the help and support around instructional design. They've appreciated sharing their expertise, learning from each other, and seeing what works in other schools and seeing if they could apply that to their schools. And we've also increased a great deal the attention and planning for students transitioning from one school to another. It's really interesting what the feeder pattern social worker, but also the principals and staff in this area, how they're able to really closely connect with those feeder schools with students moving across levels. So those were really the lessons that we learned and the really important data that we gathered. So this is our recommendation for the special education staffing model. If you go down to the third bullet, that pretty much says what our recommendation is in plain language. We're recommending, based on what we've learned, that we expand the weighted student formula district-wide. And to do that, we will need an additional 5.8 teachers, which we have incorporated into the budget. Some schools, based on enrollment and need, will get more allocation. Some will get less allocation. Not because it's a cut, but because the needs of the students or the enrollment has changed. What we found was this. Going back up to the first bullet, the memorial attendance area had a significantly reduced need for more. 85% of the allocation changes were in non-pilot schools. And the memorial attendance area schools were far better set up for the first day than the non-pilot area schools. And we talked to principals about that, gathered their feedback about how they were set up and what support we provided. And it was really, really important information to hear directly from the schools how that was going. So those are some really important pieces of information that we learned. The process will continue to do these things. Allocate the maximum amount to schools up front so that schools can do their hiring early. We know that that teachers with special education certification are hard to find. They are hard to fill positions, so we want to push out as much as we can to get those early hires made. And we also have to sort of find that sweet spot and maintain a little bit of unallocated for mid-year adjustments or any emergency adjustments. As I said, early allocation promotes more resource stability and hiring. Also, as we worked through the allocation process, within the process, there's an element actually of rounding that comes very early in the process. As we round to the next whole number, that will build in for schools automatically sort of this room to grow on caseloads of between 4 and 7 students. The allocation accounts for students in referral. We know that some schools have students that are in initial evaluation at a placement rate we calculate. We also use a differentiated weighted formula for factors that trigger supplemental SEA. That might be for students who need bathrooming or feeding or some sort of health-related service. Those are supplemental hours that work into the factor as well. And then we plan to continue our summer transition planning project. We invested $200,000 in that last summer. It gave all schools between 2 and 4 full days to plan with cross-categorical teachers and SEAs how they were going to set their schools up for success. So that's something that we would also want to continue moving into next year. So I will pause there and, is that right? Pause there? Yeah.
Before we get into
Yeah.
summer
Yep.
school.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's not
before we get
fair,
to the
is
next
it?
one, I'll pause.
Several questions, some comments. How many SEA individuals did you speak with, the teachers did you speak with about the weighted formula?
Yeah, so we gathered input from a variety of stakeholders. So SEAs, teachers, principals participated in a survey. About 700 people participated in the survey, district-wide.
Do you know how many were teachers and SEAs? Because we keep hearing about how much the principals like it, and I'm wondering the data on the SEAs and the teachers and how they're adapting to it.
Well, I have a special education staff advisory, so that is comprised of teachers and SEAs. And so part of the analysis has been to interview principals, teachers on the advisory, and through surveys and other forms of data collection.
But you didn't directly interview them without the survey. I'm just trying to figure out where we're at.
Yeah.
Understood. My second question is on the weighted formula. Namely, I'm not sure 1 year of encouraged by the increase on hours for certain disorders. I worry that if we do this district-wide without doing another year of a pilot, I feel that that could be a mistake. I do that because we've had a lot of SEA shortages. We've had a lot of people who need assistance. Additionally, I feel that limiting the number of cross-categorical teachers and putting them in the flex pool, I'm sorry, but I need teachers who are trained in cross-categorical, not just flex. I appreciate the work, I respect the work, but I have to be 100% honest because I promised that I would. I cannot vote for anything that will limit the use of SEAs in the classroom or limit the amount of cross-categorical aides in the classroom and teachers in the classroom, but I respect the work and I thank you for it.
Can I just,
Do you want a response?
I may be misinterpreting, Nikki, so bear with me on this. Yeah.
happens, I do it a lot.
So just to be really clear, when we say we moved allocation into the flex pool, that's the special education flex pool. And that flex pool can be used based on need to either, sometimes we have principals actually convert it to teacher, sometimes they convert it to SEA, It just gives sort of principals a little bit more flexibility based, but I just wanted to be sure you weren't thinking that it was general ed flex.
I understand
It's
that.
special ed flex.
And I just wanted to say, we gave $1 million to special ed previously. I just want to make sure that things get going the right way,
Yeah.
that everything is included. Because I think you're right, on releasing all the allocated at what the schools get done earlier is necessary. I think that is a good portion of it. I just believe that the SEA and the cross-categorical are vital in this situation.
Yeah, if I might, I'm not sure if you're recommending to use our existing formula in lieu of the weighted student formula. I will say that the weighted student formula, if you compare how much that generates versus our standard formula that we've been using for years, it's about 10.8 more. So if you're suggesting that we weight, that would be withholding 10.8 teachers. So I'm assuming that you're not in support of that, and you're advocating for using the evidence-based weighted student formula, which generates actually more special ed resources.
Actually, I'm not, because I want to make sure that every single teacher knows how to handle it and works on it and isn't in a specific area or on a weighted formula, especially under the concerns of Andrew F. versus the United States Supreme Court case, which states that a free appropriate public education must be narrowly tailored to an individual's specific needs. It doesn't say a weighted formula, it says it has to be individualized. I feel that this weighted formula is not individualized.
So, you all know where my interest has been around special education. That is really our students, particularly our African American students, who are disproportionately designated under EBD. And so I'm just wondering, what have we learned from Memorial, if anything, around this? And my continued concern is, what resources are we giving the students, particularly in a very focused effort, if any?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, and then if anyone else wants to join. So what we've learned from the memorial attendance area is that there have been far fewer requests for additional allocation. There have been far fewer requests for time-limited SEAs, and the feeling is that while there's no one that's like overly staffed, that the formula is much tighter and much more tailored to the needs of students. So, for example, at Memorial High School, the difference between the old formula and the new formula is 3 teachers. 3 teachers also generates nearly 3 SEAs. That's 6 people more. And actually, I think that they've had some challenges in terms of being full strength for the entirety of the year, but the overall determination was that this allocation is actually meeting our students' needs. So it's really, we're only at the halfway point of the very first year, so it's not like we can point to there are tangible student outcomes increases right now, but I can say on just some of the very initial metrics that we're using to evaluate this, that all indications are that this is a much more accurate and equitable way of distributing resources. As Lisa noted too, we've only just begun to turn our attention to how best to use special education resources with our principal professional learning communities, and taking advantage of some of the special education leadership coaching from former principals who have particular expertise in the area of leading for special education. So, yeah, I'll stop right there, and if you have anything else, okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's just, as we connect this with our equity strategies, I see this part of it, right? I mean, a huge component of it. And and I think we should just move in that direction, right? I mean, as we're looking at our equity strategies and looking at our students who are categorized under EBD, right? I mean, what are we doing to actually target and support those students in that designation? Right? I don't know, everybody's looking at me.
Mhm.
No, it's a
Yeah,
good question. That's a really good.
That's the lead to the.
I think, I don't know if this will help, and then maybe Kelly, you have something else, but the one thing that we heard from teachers, SEAs, and staff, even before we embarked on this, is they said, please develop a formula that is based on the needs of the children and not just numbers. They all told, that was the number one thing they told us. Teachers told us that, SEAs told us that, families told us that. You know, my child is not just a number on a caseload. My child actually has needs. And for some of our children, the way the IEPs are written, some have, written for more support than others based on the needs that they have. And the weightings on that were generated actually from our own IEPs that our families and teachers had written together, because IEPs are developed with families and school staff. It's a team. No one, person decides that. So the weighted allocation allows principals and school staff an opportunity to, develop some sort of maybe either customized accommodation or modification or support in an inclusive classroom based on that person's needs or that student's needs that maybe wouldn't have been available in a traditional head count model. And then the time before the school year starts and the time during the year when principals can talk. I know that some of the teachers went and visited one of my old schools and developed some strategies that some of my special education teachers had used with students that had very particular needs, and that wouldn't have happened had it not been in the weighted formula. So that's a little bit.
Is this part of your evaluation and measurement? Like as you're, particularly the EBD designation?
Yeah, what else are we
What?
able to provide for those students
Yes,
that we
and
might
what's-
not have been able to have provided before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the other thing that I would add is that, remember when we were in this position a year ago, we also added additional student services personnel.
that's right.
Psychosocial work.
Right.
So it's not just a pure special ed resource issue, it's
Yeah.
somewhat of a multiple layer
Yeah.
cake, so to speak, about strong instructional system in the general education, PBIS, it's expansion of our supports for students with mental health needs, Bounce Back, CBITS, expansion into the high schools for CBITS. It's the expansion of mental health within our school system, the BHS programs, which are all adding to increased networks of support for our students with emotional behavioral disabilities.
Yep.
Yeah, and so really honing in on the outcomes of students with emotional behavioral disabilities will be a focal point of our special education external program evaluation. So I think that will probably be a more sophisticated review of the outcomes, and along with recommendations on how we can evolve to become better at that, versus our only 6 months into this the weighted student formula analysis.
Great, thank you. That
Yeah.
helps.
I wanted to expand a little bit on Gloria's question and to be more specific around racial disproportionality. So out of the allocation to address racial disproportionality from the state, how much what is it showing? Where is it showing here, if at all?
What do you mean exactly by the
So-
resources for disproportionality?
Yeah, so 15% of our budget is to address racial
Okay.
disproportionality. for special
Okay.
ed, right?
Yep.
And so how is that translated here, if at all?
It's not at all here. So those resources are actually targeted to elementary schools in the form of interventionists. So we look at schools that have higher levels of disproportionality and that would benefit from having targeted personnel. So these funds our CCEIS funds are targeted to elementary, early intervention, right? So early intervening services, specifically for reading specialists. And we're seeing the results of students who are benefiting from the intensive interventions at the earlier grade levels.
Okay. Chris?
So thank you for all of this. I just have one question, and that was about a year ago, the board got a memo that laid out some evaluation criteria for the weighted formula. And before moving forward to expand the pilot, I think it would be really helpful to actually get a report back on those specific evaluation criteria. I think a lot of what you've discussed here addresses some of them, but actually getting a point-by-point response to the evaluation criteria that the board got a year ago, just so that we can wrap our heads around, like, where's this going really well, where's this maybe not going so well that we could do better. I think that would just help us in our function of making decisions about the budget. And as we move forward, how we evaluate the weighted formula in the context of the bigger special education evaluation effort is something I would actually like to talk about. So how's the weighted formula going to play into that evaluation? And also, how can we start to look at student outcomes as a piece of the weighted formula decision? So.
Okay.
Nikki, and then maybe we can move on to the next.
Absolutely. I just wanted to amplify Chris's comments. I think the data would be helpful. Also, especially what the criteria are, and discussing on the criteria. Also, discussing how the weighted formula works is a discussion I think would be really helpful for the board to have, because it'll end up answering a lot of questions that could be confusing.
We can send some of that back around.
Yeah, we can, Nikki, we can send that back out again and we can do,
That would be great.
yeah, we can do an update on the factors that we were going to use for
I'd
expansion.
love to discuss it as well, but I'm not sure we can get it in time.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Just wanted to give a quick update on our Title I funds. Thank you, John. We don't have the final numbers on the Title I grant yet, so we always budget on an estimate of $6.5 million. We put $5 million of that into Title I school budgets on a per pupil basis. And in rank order of poverty, we assign a per pupil amount that then aggregates up to a total for each school. So the strategy remains the same as it has in past years. We're not assuming any additional budget increases. We're assuming one grant award. We've allocated to Title I schools, as I said, in rank order of poverty, and we use a tiered approach so that we are focusing our resources to schools that need it the most as an equity-based strategy. There will be Title I decreases for some schools. That's because of perhaps changes in direct certification counts, changes in straight-up enrollment counts, and also, as I said before, as average salaries go up, Title I dollars don't go as far. So some of our schools will see decreases in Title I simply because of the salary changes. Also, just wanted to know that we spend down carryover a little bit more every year, and we do have an impact of our charters on our Title I funds as well. I will say, because some of you are probably wondering what's the difference between the 6.5 and the 5. We actually, according to federal law, have to allocate a certain amount to private and parochial schools. And that is a sizable chunk out of that. We also have a mandatory admin cost that we have to take out to run the program. And then we also really work hard to maintain carryover. Sometimes unexpected things come up, and as salaries go up, we want to be able to stay ahead of that a little bit with a robust enough and healthy enough carryover from year to year.
We provide a full analysis of that in the back of the budget book every year.
Yeah, thanks. So these are just the next steps in our process. I've been referring to this all evening. The pre-budget work phase is over. The workbook labs start next week. Workbooks go out this Friday by 4 o'clock. There's a phase 3 presentation where workbook and Title I approvals are happening with chiefs. And then there's also the communication plan about how schools are sharing this information with their school staff and their stakeholders. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to summer school, and I'm going to invite Bree up to the table. I'll slide over.
Good evening, everyone. So I am actually presenting to you as, you want me to skip over the discussion first? Or, okay. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm actually presenting to you within a new role with MMSD. I am the new Director of Strategic Partnerships, but I wanted to make sure that I closed out my last summer school with you all. My current successor is Nicole Schaefer. If you've ever known her or worked with her, she was a principal at Toki and was at the Standards Institute with a bunch of staff from the central office, so could not be here this evening, but I wanted to ensure that presented, and if, of course, you have any questions or feedback, I would be sure to relay that to her. So for the summer school presentation this year, it's effectively couching it within the larger budget conversation. As Kelly mentioned earlier, it's going to go to early approval for you guys because we need to start implementing this program year. It spans 2 fiscal years. You will have received in your board update last week some additional documents, the overall summer school report, the budget, the outcomes report, and in particular, we wanted to draw your attention to 3 main pieces for the budget this year. The first being an overall 6.73% reduction in the budget, so it amounts to about $250,000. We were able to do that adequately with funding the program while still being fiscally responsible. This is hoping or to help add to that reduction that we are seeing in the budget gap in the overall 2020 to 2021 cycle. So we're trying to find ways to assist with that. This was mainly achieved by 3 areas. 1, reducing the number of summer school sites yet again by 1 elementary site and 2 middle school sites. There will still be all 4 comprehensive high schools. And that really takes away administrative costs. So the cost to run the program from an administrative level, but not from a staff support level. So the staffing that would have been required to support students, especially in areas of special education, English language learners, were just reallocated to the different sites. There weren't cuts in those numbers. It was really cuts in administration. The second was aligning the weekly hours of teacher pay to the current handbook language. And you will see that that is specifically 25 versus 30 hours a week. So now we are in alignment with what has been agreed upon by MTI. And last, we tightened the summer school criteria for our students. This will result in an overall reduction in the number of students enrolling in summer school, but nominally, because the intention will be that with this tightening of criteria, we will be having school principals really supporting the enrollment of the students who should be attending summer school. If you will note in some of the materials, we invite a lot of students to summer school. 10,000 or so every single year, but we don't have that number enroll, and so we really wanted to ensure that we tightened what criteria we are using so that we can increase the number of students enrolling in summer school from about 45 to 50% to a much higher ratio, about 60 to 70%.
So I think the only things I'd like to add real quick to that is the reports that Bree just mentioned are up on the website. And if they're not already, will be very soon. So those are publicly available. We just didn't have a lot of time today. And the board had not separately posted a summer school discussion. So, but they're all available. And overall, from my analysis of the summer school budget over the last few years, what I think has been happening, and it does tend to happen here in the district, is we start with a targeted strategy, right? Like an intent to help a certain segment of the population. And what happens is over time, a broader base of the population wants that too. And so the district tends to take targeted strategies and over a course of 3 to 4 years, turn them into universal strategies. I think summer school is one of what is probably a few examples of that. Summer school is designed to assist students who kind of need more assistance to get back on grade level, targeted support. And through kind of our processes of enrichment and other things, summer schools become much bigger than what it was actually intended to designed for. And unfortunately, we just don't get funded from the state for summer school at that kind of levels, right? Summer school is not intended to be daycare, right? And so we really need to be tighter with our enrollment criteria, which Bree just explained, to make sure that we have the resources available to support the students kind of who need it the most. So with that, I think that's all we have at this point. We're happy to answer any questions.
Any final questions, or Chris?
Just a quick summer school question. Are we continuing our policy of enrolling siblings? Like if one
Yes.
student gets invited?
Yes.
It's been a very successful.
Absolutely. It represented about, for grades kindergarten through fourth grade in particular, it was about 8% of the overall students. We had about 300 families take advantage of this. And just anecdotally, I can say that it made the difference for many families between being able to have their children all, let's say the child that needed summer school enroll by having a safe space for their other children. And so just, again, anecdotally, but about 300 or so families took advantage of that. And it was a very supportive move for all of our summer school families.
Any other questions?
Just a quick comment around summer school. I think my experience has been just having some consistency, like what is happening. Where I feel like there's been years that it made sense to be recommended. Other years, my daughter hasn't got recommended, but she should have. And so, like, just not knowing what is summer school for. I think really trying to understand, and I appreciate you also putting out there, Kelly. It became a thing that either students that already have a lot of access and opportunities were getting even greater access and opportunities because now they're being able to, participate in class in a much stronger way. And also trying to understand a little bit more, like, what is actually happening, because there's been years that the balance around instruction and enrichment has been, like, off, or, parents never understand, like, what is it really happening.
Any final questions, comments?
Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, do I have a motion to adjourn? Anika, your advisory vote? All in favor? Aye. Motion passes, we are adjourned.